As I suggested in the last video, today we're going to keep on talking about this central section of Luke's Gospel, sometimes known as the travel section or the travelogue, though I don't necessarily like to use that phrase for it, but sometimes it's just called the central section. This goes from Luke 9:51 to approximately Luke, I would say 18 verse 30. Let me just double check that. I think it is Luke 18. Yes, Luke 18:30. Because in Luke 18:31, he picks up in a way that is very easily put together with the other synoptics. But in between, and that's a lot of chapters, it is very difficult to figure out the chronology and where things fit together. Now, this can give rise to a bit of a problem. I'm going to suggest that if you want, you could have a Bible at hand. I'm going to be putting together 3 different passages in this video. Luke 9 verses 51 and following, Luke 17 verses 11 and following, and John 7 about verses 1 through 10. So what's the problem concerning Luke's central section? Well, in Luke 9:51, he uses this odd word that is translated differently in different translations, but it says the days were at hand, or the days were accomplished, or the time was at hand, some phrase like that, for Jesus to be, and then received up is sort of a literal translation of it. Some modern translations say for his ascension, and it may refer to his ascension. I tend to think it refers to his death, for him to be received up, taken up onto the cross in death. But either way, those are kind of close together anyway, his death and his ascension. So, and when that time had come, he set his face to go to Jerusalem, it says. And then for the rest of the time, Luke keeps talking about he was journeying to Jerusalem. He has 3 other places where he mentions it. In chapter 13, the passage we talked about the Perean ministry last week. Then in 17:11, he mentions it. And then in 18:31, it says that, he tells the disciples, we're going to Jerusalem, I'm going to be killed. So it almost looks like this is all one journey. But when you examine the details of that central section of Luke, you realize this cannot possibly be all one journey. It only took a few days to walk from from Galilee to Jerusalem. And if Jesus had set his face, he's going to go. We find him in chapter 10 in the house of Mary and Martha. Luke just says a certain village. He doesn't apparently know where they lived. But from John, we know that was Bethany. That's right on the Mount of Olives. It's right near Jerusalem. But then in Luke 17, as we'll be talking about today, he's back up near the border of Samaria and Galilee. It's back up north again. So this doesn't look like one journey to Jerusalem of one guy who set his face because it's time for him to die. Okay, what's that all about? Now here, the concept of achronological narration is extremely important. And I've discussed that in many other videos, especially the first video of my temple cleansing series. And you can look that up if I remember. I'll try to link it in the show notes. That many times in this central section of Luke, in fact, I would say the central section is one of the places with the most achronological narration in all of the Gospels. This is one reason, by the way, why when Luke refers to setting things in order when he talks to Theophilus in his introduction, I don't think he does mean chronological order, because this is huge achronological middle section. You can even tell it sometimes with sayings sections in there. It'll be sayings on prayer. It'll just say Jesus was praying in a certain place. And we don't know where, we don't know when, or it will say, and he said to his disciples, and then it'll have several sayings on the subject of offense or stumbling. So if anybody ever tells you, for example, that Luke puts the saying about causing a little one to stumble, that Luke puts this in a different context from Matthew, what he's telling you is wrong. Because when you look that verse up in Luke, you see that he doesn't say what the context was. He doesn't have a context. and Jesus just says it. Okay, so in a lot of these places, this could be sayings that Luke learned about that he didn't know when they took place. They don't even have to take place after Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. But in some places, he'll say while he was on his way to Jerusalem. So was that the same journey or what? Well, the fact that it says that the days were approaching for him to be received up, what does that tell us? We got to give that some meaning. That's got to mean something. I have a blog post from 2018, and I will, I think, remember to link this below, where I gave, I think, the correct general solution to this, which is that this is in Luke 9:51 when he is last leaving Galilee. He's not going to be in Galilee, having a Galilean ministry again at this point. There's a kind of a Galilee-centric characteristic to the synoptics. Peter, James, John, Andrew, Philip, these guys were all from up north, up there. Maybe even more of the disciples. We're not told how many of them were, but several of the most prominent ones. And many of Jesus' most prominent female followers were initially in Galilee with him and then followed him from Galilee to Jerusalem and were there at his death and burial and resurrection. So when he leaves Galilee for the last time, and then he spends the rest of his life before his death down there in the Jerusalem area and in Perea, the Transjordan, as we discussed in the last video, that would naturally stick in their minds as the time when he was going to Jerusalem and he was leaving Galilee. So that doesn't necessarily have to be for that Passover right then. And in fact, I would relate John 7, 1 through 10 to Luke 9:51. Okay? And what's he doing in John 7, 1 through 10? He's going to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles in the fall, around this time of year. If we relate that to Luke, and then if we say that he never had a Galilean ministry again, and that the crucifixion occurred, about 6 months later, the next Passover, then that could be his last journey from Galilee. Then he could be going to Jerusalem on multiple occasions, but from the Transjordan, not all the way from up in Galilee. So when Luke hears this happened while he was on his way to Jerusalem, he doesn't necessarily know, which time, but it doesn't have to always be that one trip, like it was just one trip. And that wouldn't really make sense for it to just be one trip, both because of this sort of a loop back and forth between Bethany and then up again north near Samaria, and also because it says he sent the 70 out after this, after he set his face to go to Jerusalem. Well, it's only going to be a few days in the Passion Week. Why would he send the 70 out? But if it's 6 months, then that makes more sense. So I think we could put a lot together that way, and I think that was right, what I said in that blog post. But I also think I can add to it now. So here's a kind of a cool thing. I was researching a little bit on the relations between the Samaritans and the Galileans concerning journeys from Galilee for the feast to Jerusalem. Josephus tells about a murder that actually took place some years after the time of Jesus, where the Samaritans just were so fed up they didn't like the Galileans coming through their land, they actually murdered a Galilean pilgrim. And then the Galileans thought this was not prosecuted sufficiently strongly, and then there was all kind of trouble and dust-ups and trying to figure out who was right and who started it and so forth. Why? Because of the dislike the Samaritans had for the Galileans to be traveling through their land, and they would have hordes of pilgrims, not just from Galilee, but from other places, coming over through Samaria and down to Jerusalem for the big feasts that had to be celebrated in Jerusalem, such as the Feast of Booths and Passover. So, and also another reason this would have been touchy, even though Josephus doesn't mention it, but it fits with the woman at the well, is that the Jews despised the Samaritans and believed that they did not have the true worship of Yahweh. Now, remember that the Samaritans thought that they were worshiping the true God, that they were worshiping Yahweh, the same God that the Jews worshipped. But the Jews denied this and said they had a corrupted worship. And the Jews said, you must worship in Jerusalem. And the woman at the well brings this up. So every time you had these hordes of pilgrims going down through Samaria to Galilee, that's emphasizing, we think we're better than you. We think we're going to the right place to worship, and you're worshiping in Mount Gerizim, and that's the wrong place to worship God. So you got everything all messed up. So that would also heighten those tensions. Now let's put this together with this idea that Jesus is traveling at the time spoken of in John 7. We find there a dialogue between him and his brothers. His brothers kind of mock him and say, hey, why don't you go to Jerusalem and reveal yourself? And he says, you go ahead. My time is not yet come. And so they go. And it says he stayed in Galilee, but afterwards he went to Jerusalem, as it were, in secret. So he waited. And he didn't travel maybe with the main body of people who were traveling. So just to begin with, the Samaritans would have been unhappy because of all these pilgrims. But then all the more so if Jesus is kind of a late comer, a late traveler. They've already had a bunch of pilgrims going through. Well, what do we find in Luke 9? Jesus sends his disciples to try to get lodging for him in a Samaritan village, and they refuse. And it says because his face was set to go to Jerusalem. Now, I think that fits together really well. I think this one's pretty strong. With the idea that this was at the time of a feast. Notice, Luke doesn't mention any feast. Okay, but this wasn't at a time of a feast. And then even better, given that he was a little bit later than the rest of the pilgrims and their patience is already worn thin. They refused to let him through. That, of course, is that very famous time when James and John say, should we call down fire? And Jesus rebukes them. And then it just says they went on to another village. Now, it doesn't say where this other village was. Let me just add that this idea of connecting Luke 9:51 with John 7 is not just mine. I came up with it on my own, but then later I learned that it's been suggested by John Wenham, the late John Wenham, and also John A.T. Robinson. And Wenham lists some other scholars as well. So this is not just some idea that Lydia came up with. Not that I mind being the only one with an idea, but in this case, it's not only me. And I think that fits together really well. Now, I have a further conjecture. This is weaker. This is more conjectural. I'm not going to die on this hill, but I'd like you to consider it because I think it's kind of a cool thought. In Luke 17, we have an incident where Jesus heals 10 lepers. One of them is a Samaritan, you'll remember. And it says there in Luke 17:11 that he was on his way to Jerusalem and he was traveling between or through the midst of Galilee and Samaria. Now, Wenham points out, and others have also pointed out, that the valley of Jezreel, which was part of the Decapolis, the Greek area, fits this description really well. And I'm going to link to a place where you can find a map that shows this valley of the Jezreel is kind of this Decapolis area kind of sticking into Galilee there. And Wenham points out that this was actually a place where there was a way that you could travel if you didn't want to travel through Samaria to get to Jerusalem and you were coming from Galilee. It could be kind of dangerous. So there was a sort of a secondary route that you could go along the valley of the Jezreel, okay? And, I should maybe do it this way, okay? Going east, and then cross the Jordan River and then go down on the other side of the Jordan River, the Transjordan, in fact. Through Perea, and in that way approach Jerusalem. And it would be a quieter way to go, less well-traveled, but it was a way that some did travel. Now, I just want to suggest something, and here I'm departing a little bit from Wenham. Wenham has each place where Luke says that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem, and he suggests these should be connected to different feasts. Since much of this narration is achronological, and since all that Luke says in 17:11 is he was on his way to Jerusalem, I'm going to suggest that Luke did not know exactly how this fit with the other things he had said, but that this should actually be connected with Luke 9:51 and following, that this was at that time. Suggestion. When the Samaritans refused to let him enter their village, what would be more natural then for Jesus to turn east and go along the valley of the Jezreel instead of traveling through Samaria, and then go down on the other side of the Jordan, which would also fit with what John says when he says, as it were, secretly, because he wasn't going with all those other pilgrims the way that they would go, or at exactly the time when they would go. So that would fit with his rejection in Samaria. If we take that incident in Luke 17 and we see it as being narrated achronologically, but actually occurring over there. When Luke says they went on to another village, he doesn't say that it was another village in Samaria. He just says another village. So I think that's kind of cool. And then for the rest of it, it's taking place, at some time or other. And some of these things that Luke definitely narrates as taking place after Jesus set his face, like the sending out of the 70, those can be fitted into those 6 months. Or when he says he was, on his way to Jerusalem, like in chapter 13, then that's one of the times when he's traveling from he's in the Transjordan, he's in Perea, and he's going to Jerusalem either for his final Passover or for one of the other feasts. In John, we know that he went in for the Feast of Tabernacles from Galilee, and then he was there at the Feast of the Dedication, which we would call Hanukkah, and then, of course, the final Passover of his life. So these can be times when he's journeying to Jerusalem. Again, I'm not going to absolutely hang my hat on that thing of moving Luke 17 back to Luke 9, or that passage about the healing of the lepers, but I think it fits really well. And geographically, it's neat, it's clean, because it's possible that Jesus, for some reason, went back that far north again during that 6-month period. It's not impossible. That could be fitted, into John's chronology, but it would make even more sense if he just spent his time there in the Transjordan and only went back and forth to Jerusalem and didn't go all the way back to the Jezreel Valley. But he very well could have traveled along the Jezreel Valley after he was rejected in Samaria. So I think that's kind of cool. And this just shows the use of imagination. And this is what I call reconcilable variation. It gets derided as some kind of desperate harmonization. This is actually good historical reasoning, especially if we're appropriately tentative about our conclusions. But it's a sign of truth in the narratives that we can fit them together in these ways, even if there's at first an appearance of oddity about them. And that's a good way to treat secular historical documents as well. But the way that harmonization gets treated, it's like, oh, that's just some desperate theological thing. And it's not. So don't let anyone ever tell you not to try in a gentle way like this, and a careful way, and an appropriately cautious way, to apply historical imagination to fit together documents that present themselves as historical. That's actually a very legitimate tool. And don't let anybody sort of bully you and say, that smacks of harmonization. That's very, very strained. It's not. I mean, it's not actually very strained. And I think it's evident that Luke is being achronological in much of this central section. And at that point, it's just a question of, what the actual chronological relations are. And to some extent, we are guessing. But that's the kind of analysis that we do here. And so thank you for coming and watching the Lydia McGrew YouTube channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.